Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, they're going to be looking at something pretty interesting. It's an episode of the podcast Flower in the River, and in this episode, the host, Natalie, she makes this startling discovery about unmarked graves, and they're connected to the Eastland Disaster back in 1915 in Chicago. But what's really cool about this is that she kind of weaves this whole historical investigation with her own family history.
Yeah, it's really a unique approach. It shows the tragedy of the Eastland disaster, but it also shows the gaps in how we remember and commemorate events like this, like who gets remembered and who's just forgotten by history.
Totally. So let's start with the Eastland disaster. So for those who don't know, it was a passenger ship and it capsized in the Chicago River back in 1915. And it was a huge tragedy. Over 800 people died. And Natalie, she's working on documenting the lives of all of these victims, going beyond just the facts and statistics. She wants to show who these people really were.
Yeah, and this is where Zet's work is so important. By focusing on each of the victims' stories, she's giving a voice to the people who might have just been forgotten. For example, she finds the story of Augusta Polk Adler, and we learn about her through her husband's account of trying to save her as the ship was sinking. It just shows the personal impact of this tragedy.
It's just awful to think about. And it gets even worse when Natalie discovers that even after almost 110 years, some of these Eastland victims still don't even have grave markers. So we're talking about people like Maria and Martha Adamovitz, May Anderson, David Benson, Albert Beale, and James Harry. All these people. And they're just gone. Like no one even knows they were ever here, which raises questions about how we think about the past.
Yeah, and when you think about the time period, it's even more interesting. I mean, back then, the societal norms around death and burial were so different. Things like if they had money problems, their family, and even societal biases could have played a part in if someone even got a grave marker. It makes you think about these things that we don't really talk about and how they still affect how we see history today.
For sure. One story that really got to me was May Anderson's. She went on this Eastland trip only because her sister's husband couldn't go.
Wow.
It's crazy to think how a decision like that could lead to something so terrible.
It really changes how you see these historical games. We think of them as something that happened way back when, but her story reminds us that history is made of real people making choices and having relationships, just like us. It makes the past feel more real.
Yeah. And then there's James Harry. He was an immigrant from Scotland, and his story really shows us the immigration and the economics of that time. He was only in the U.S. for 14 months before the Eastland disaster, and he left behind his widowed mother and two brothers back in Scotland. Zet really shows how his story is like the other side of immigration, Like all those numbers are actual people.
I see what you mean. James Harry's story reminds us that historical events aren't just things that happened. They're connected to the lives of regular people. His trip to America, ending so tragically, it shows the complicated reasons why people move throughout history.
Totally. And what's really interesting is that while she's looking into these unmarked graves, Zet comes across this claim that single men were always buried in unmarked graves in Chicago back in 1915.
Right.
So it's like this common practice.
That's strange.
And of course, she's like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right, and starts digging deeper. And it's a good lesson for all of us, don't just believe everything you hear, especially when it comes to history.
Right. It's like she's saying, do your own research.
Yeah, exactly. So she looks through all of her research on Eastland victims, and there's nothing to support this claim.
So what did she do?
Well, she doesn't stop there. She goes and looks at all these different historical records and even uses AI to check it out. But she keeps saying how important it is to think critically and to cite sources.
Yeah, you can't just trust anything you see online these days.
Nope. So did she actually find anything to back up this claim?
Well, even after all that work, she proves it wrong. It turns out that unmarked graves in Chicago back then, they were usually for very specific situations, like if they were in an institution or in prison, or they couldn't identify the body.
Ah, I see. So it's not as simple as just being a single man.
Nope. And this really shows how we need to be careful with historical information, especially now when there's so much out there. It's a reminder to be skeptical of things we see online or hear from people, and always check if it comes from a good source.
That's a great point. Now, while all this is going on with the unmarked graves, Zet is also exploring her own family history. And it all started with her Aunt Pearl, who got her interested in genealogy with this 38-page family history document.
Oh, wow. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's amazing. And this document ends up taking Zet to this little village in Wisconsin called Fall Creek, and it turns out her family has deep roots there.
Wow, so she's discovering all this stuff about her family, and at the same time, she's uncovering these unmarked graves and trying to figure out what happened to them. It's like two mysteries unfolding at once.
Exactly. And get this, when she gets to Fall Creek, she feels this strong connection to the place, even though she's never been there before, and just shows how powerful family history can be.
That's amazing. It's like you're drawn to the place where your ancestors lived.
It really is. And the best part is, the people in Fall Creek are totally dedicated to preserving their local history. They have historical societies, museums, and the whole community is involved in keeping the past alive. It's incredible.
Wow, that's amazing. So you have these forgotten souls in Chicago and this small town that's doing everything to remember its past. It makes you think about how differently we value and preserve history.
It really does. And it makes you wonder, why are these Eastland victims forgotten while this small town is making so much effort to remember its history? Is it just chance, or are there deeper reasons?
That's a really good question. It makes you think about how we decide who gets remembered and who fades into obscurity.
Yeah. And you know what? This contrast between the forgotten Eastland victims and how dedicated Fall Creek is, it makes you think, preserving history isn't always about building monuments or being famous. Sometimes it's about those small, everyday efforts by people in a community who want to make sure their stories aren't lost.
Right. It's about those small acts of remembrance that keep the past alive.
Exactly. And it reminds us that we all have a responsibility to keep our shared memories safe. So going back to those unmarked graves, Zet starts thinking about why they might even exist in the first place. Maybe money problems, no family, or just how people thought back then.
Right, like we talked about how things were so different back then, and what we might think is wrong today could have been totally normal in the early 1900s.
Yeah, it's like a window into a different time with different values. And while we might not agree with everything they did back then, it's important to understand why things happened the way they did.
Totally. It helps us get a more complete picture of the past and see things from a different perspective.
Right. And it's interesting how Zet connects her experience with these forgotten graves to what she found at Fall Creek. It's like she sees this small town that's so good at remembering its past, and she's wondering if maybe that's how we should all be approaching history.
Yeah, Fall Creek sounds like a community that really cherishes its past and understands how important it is to preserve the stories of its people, both the everyday folks and the more notable ones. I mean, they even sell local history books at the bank. That's incredible.
I know, right? You don't see that every day. And what I love is that Zet doesn't just show us these two different ways of dealing with history. She actually challenges us to do something about it. She wants us to think about the stories in our own families and communities that might be in danger of being forgotten.
And that's where it becomes a shared responsibility. We can't just rely on institutions or historians to do all the work. It's up to all of us as individuals, families, and communities to make sure our history is passed down to the next generation.
It could be as simple as talking to an older relative, looking through old photo albums, or researching our family tree.
Exactly. Every little bit of information, every story, and every object from the past adds to our understanding of who we are and where we came from.
It's almost like Zet saying, hey, don't wait for someone else to do it. Be the one who saves those forgotten stories and make sure they get the attention they deserve.
Yeah, and her story about Fall Creek shows us how to do it, how to make preserving history a part of our everyday lives.
Totally. And what's amazing is that it all started with her Aunt Pearl and that 38-page document. It was a simple act of preserving family history, but it set off this whole chain reaction. It led to discovering those unmarked graves and a renewed appreciation for how powerful our individual actions can be.
It shows how one person's effort can make a difference. It's like ripples spreading out, inspiring others, shining light on forgotten stories, and helping us understand our shared past better.
Exactly. And it's not just about experts and institutions. It's about everyday people taking the time to document, share, and celebrate the stories that make up our families, communities, and our history as a whole.
And what's really cool is that it can be so personal. You can learn about your own family, your own town, your own neighborhood. There are stories hidden everywhere just waiting to be discovered.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to ask you something. Zet shows us this amazing community in Fall Creek that's so dedicated to its history. But do you think there's a downside to focusing so much on just local history? Like, could we miss the bigger picture or ignore parts of the past that aren't so great?
That's a great question. And it raises an important point about the potential problems of getting too focused on just local history. It's great to celebrate your local heritage, but we need to be careful not to get stuck in a narrow view of the past.
Like historical tunnel vision, right? Only seeing things from your own community's perspective.
Yes, exactly. It's like you're looking at history through a keyhole and missing the bigger picture. You might overlook how your local story connects to national trends, social movements, and events that happened elsewhere.
So how do we get the balance right? How do we celebrate local stories while still understanding the bigger picture?
Well, I think the key is to remember that local history is always part of a larger story. It's about understanding how individual stories and local events connect to those broader historical trends, movements, and narratives.
It's like zooming in and out, right? You need to see the details up close, but you also need to step back and see how it all fits together.
Exactly. It's about seeing those connections and understanding that history happens on different levels, from our own backyard to the global stage.
So if we're trying to learn from Fall Creek, it's not about copying them exactly, but about adapting their model to our own communities while keeping that broader perspective in mind.
And a big part of that adaptation is being willing to look at the complexities and even the uncomfortable parts of our past. It's not just about celebrating the good stuff, but also acknowledging the mistakes, injustices, and challenges that shaped our communities and our country as a whole.
So it's not about hiding the difficult parts of history or creating a perfect version of the past.
Right? It's about embracing the whole human experience, the good and the bad. And it's about understanding that history is a constant process of learning, reinterpreting, and challenging what we think we know. It's about asking questions, looking at things from different perspectives, and being open to changing our minds as we uncover new information and face the complexities of the past.
So it's like a never-ending journey, right? Always discovering, always learning, always questioning what we thought we knew.
Yeah, and that's what makes history so fascinating. It's not just about memorizing names and dates. It's about understanding people and how their choices shaped the world we live in today.
That's a great point, and it brings us back to what Zell was saying about the power of individual action. It's not just up to historians and museums to preserve history, it's up to all of us.
Right. We all have these stories to tell, and those stories matter. They can teach us, inspire us, and help us understand each other better.
Exactly. So if we're thinking about applying the lessons we've learned from Fall Creek, it's not just about replicating their model exactly, but rather about adapting it to our own communities, while keeping that broader perspective in mind.
And I think an essential part of that adaptation is being willing to engage with the complexities and uncomfortable truths of the past. It's about celebrating the achievements and triumphs, but also acknowledging the mistakes, injustices, and challenges that shaped our communities and the nation as a whole.
So it's not about shying away from difficult topics or trying to create a sanitized version of history. It's about embracing the full spectrum of the human experience, both the good and the bad.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing that history is a continuous process of learning, reinterpreting, and challenging our assumptions. It's about asking critical questions, seeking multiple perspectives, and being open to having our views challenged and reshaped as we uncover new information and grapple with the complexities of the past.
That's a really powerful idea. History isn't set in stone. It's constantly evolving as we learn more and as our perspectives change.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so important to engage with history in an active and critical way. We need to question what we've been told, seek out diverse perspectives, and be willing to change our minds as we learn more.
So it's not just about passively absorbing information. It's about actively engaging with it, challenging it, and shaping our own understanding of the past.
Right. And that active engagement can take many forms. It can be as simple as talking to your grandparents about their lives, researching your family history, or visiting a local museum.
It's about making history relevant to our own lives and using it to understand who we are and where we come from.
And to connect with others who share our history and to learn from those who have different experiences.
I love that. So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you really hope our listeners will take away from our conversation today?
I think the most important thing is to remember that history is not just something that happened a long time ago. It's alive and it's all around us. And we all have a role to play in preserving it and sharing it with others.
That's a beautiful way to put it. So to our listeners out there, what stories in your own family or community are waiting to be uncovered? What steps can you take, inspired by Natalie Zell's work, to ensure those stories are preserved and shared with future generations? Remember, history is not just about grand narratives and famous figures. It's about the everyday lives of ordinary people. Their stories, too, deserve to be told.
So be curious, ask questions, and embrace the adventure of uncovering the hidden histories that surround you. You might be surprised by what you discover and the impact it has on your own life and understanding of the world.
That's such great advice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those historical treasures alive. It's like we have a responsibility to the past, right? To make sure those stories aren't lost.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just a burden, it's a privilege to be able to connect with the people who came before us and to learn from their experiences.
I love that. It's like carrying a torch, passing it down from generation to generation.
Exactly. And each generation adds its own fuel to the fire, new perspectives, new interpretations, new ways of understanding the past.
That makes me think about something. We've talked a lot about how important it is to be critical of historical information, especially in this age of misinformation.
Oh, yeah, that's huge. You can't just believe everything you read online or hear from someone. You have to do your own digging and think for yourself.
Exactly. So how do we balance that critical thinking with this idea of preserving and cherishing our history? Like, how do we avoid becoming so skeptical that we lose sight of the value and the beauty of the past?
That's a really good question. I think it's about finding that sweet spot between healthy skepticism and a genuine appreciation for the stories and experiences of those who came before us. We need to question and analyze, yes, but also be open to the power of those stories to move us, to teach us, and to connect us to something larger than ourselves.
So it's not about tearing down the past, it's about understanding it, even the parts that are messy or uncomfortable.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that history is a conversation, not a monologue. We're all part of that conversation, and we all have something to contribute.
That's such a great way to put it. It's like we're all adding our own voices to this grand chorus of history.
Yeah, and every voice matters. The voices of the famous and the forgotten, the powerful and the marginalized, the triumphant and the tragic, they all come together to tell the story of who we are.
And those stories have the power to change us, don't they? To make us think differently, to see the world in a new light, to connect with people we might never have otherwise met.
Absolutely. History has the power to break down barriers, to build bridges, and to remind us of our shared humanity.
That's so true. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Eastland disaster, unmarked graves, and the power of preserving history, I just want to say thank you to our listeners for joining us on this journey.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. We hope you've been inspired to explore your own history and to share the stories you find with the world.
And remember, every story matters. Every voice deserves to be heard. So go out there, be curious, ask questions, and keep the torch of history burning bright.
Until next time.
See you then. Safe for time.